Picture this. March 29, 1945. Frankfurt am Main lies in ruins, shattered by Allied bombing and advancing American forces that will capture the city within days. General Lieutenant Friedrich Kleist, a 58-year-old career officer who spent 3 years commanding Wehrmacht forces in occupied Denmark, boards a Luftwaffe transport plane at Rhine-Main Air Base in what will be recorded as his final official act. His destination, according to flight manifests that survived the war, was Berlin. But the plane never arrived in the capital. It landed instead at a small airfield in northern Germany, and from there Kleist vanished into a network of escape routes that would eventually deliver him to neutral Denmark, where he'd spent years building relationships with Danish civilians who owed him favors for protecting them from SS brutality. For 80 years, his fate would remain unknown to military historians, his name appearing on no war crimes lists, his whereabouts after March 1945 a complete mystery. Until 2025, when Danish construction workers demolishing an abandoned farmhouse near Aalborg discover a sealed room in the basement, its door hidden behind false walls for 8 decades. What they find inside will prove that some German officers didn't flee to South America after the war. They stayed closer, hiding in plain sight, guarding secrets that 3 governments had spent 80 years trying to erase from history. Secrets about what really happened in Denmark between 1940 and 1945, and what General Lieutenant Kleist had done that was so unforgivable yet so valuable that he'd been allowed to disappear rather than face trial at Nuremberg. Friedrich Kleist wasn't a Nazi in ideology, though he wore the uniform and followed orders. Born in 1887 to a Prussian military family, he'd served with distinction in the First World War, risen through the Reichswehr during the Weimar years, and remained in service when Hitler transformed Germany's military into a tool of conquest. By 1942, when he was assigned to command occupation forces in Denmark, Kleist was a pragmatist who understood that Germany had lost the war. It was only a question of when and how catastrophically. His 3 years in Denmark, from September 1942 to January 1945, were marked by what historians would later call unusually lenient occupation policies. While the SS conducted operations against Danish Jews and resistance fighters, Kleist's Wehrmacht units maintained order without the savage repression that characterized German occupation elsewhere. Danish civilians who remembered the occupation often spoke of Kleist with grudging respect, noting that he'd prevented several planned reprisals against civilian populations after sabotage attacks, arguing that harsh measures would only strengthen resistance. But there was another side to Kleist's service that few knew about. Declassified documents from British intelligence released in 2019 revealed that Kleist had been in contact with Allied agents as early as 1943, passing information about German military dispositions and hinting that he might be willing to cooperate if certain conditions were met. Those conditions, according to fragmentary records, involved protection from war crimes, prosecution, and assistance in disappearing after Germany's inevitable defeat. The final months of Kleist's documented service suggest a man preparing for evacuation. In December 1944, he requested and received transfer back to Germany, officially to assist in organizing homeland defense as Allied forces approached from both east and west. But Danish resistance members who'd worked with British intelligence reported that Kleist had been moving personal property out of Denmark for months, shipping crates to addresses in neutral Sweden and Switzerland. Whatever he was preparing for, it involved more than simply returning to a Germany that would soon be occupied and its leaders held accountable for 6 years of war and atrocity. His departure from Frankfurt on March 29, 1945, was recorded in Luftwaffe flight logs that survived the chaotic final weeks of the Reich. The plane, a Ju-52 transport, carried 15 passengers, including several other senior officers. But while the others eventually appeared in Allied custody or were confirmed killed in the war's final battles, Kleist simply vanished. Post-war investigations conducted by both Allied and later West German authorities found no trace of him, no grave, no immigration records, no sightings that could be verified. It was as if Generalleutnant Friedrich Kleist had ceased to exist the moment that plane took off from Rhine-Main. The farmhouse near Aalborg, where Kleist would eventually be discovered, had belonged to the Petersen family, Danish farmers who'd lost their eldest son to German reprisals in 1943. But after the war, rumors circulated that the family had harbored a secret, that they'd made a deal with someone important enough that American and British occupation authorities had left them strictly alone, despite evidence suggesting collaboration. Those rumors died with the last Petersen family member in 1983, and the farmhouse sat abandoned for decades, slowly deteriorating until a development company purchased the land in 2024. The demolition crew arrived in February 2025, beginning the process of tearing down structures to prepare for new construction. The farmhouse's basement was unremarkable at first inspection, containing nothing but old farming equipment and the accumulated debris of decades. But on March 12, 2025, a worker operating a sledgehammer to break through deteriorated brick walls struck something that sounded wrong. Not hollow, but deliberately reinforced. Closer inspection revealed a section of wall that had been built as a false facade, hiding a space behind it that wasn't indicated on any original construction plans. When the facade was carefully removed, what lay behind it stopped the demolition immediately. A steel door, Wehrmacht gray, bearing the eagle and swastika insignia of the Third Reich. And welded to that door was a metal plaque with text in German and Danish. Sealed by order of Allied Command, March 1946. Contents to remain undisturbed under Treaty of Copenhagen classified annexes. Unauthorized access constitutes violation of international agreement. Danish authorities contacted immediately were baffled. The Treaty of Copenhagen wasn't a widely known document, just a series of administrative agreements settling various post-war issues between Denmark and the Allied occupation forces. But classified annexes implied something more significant, agreements that hadn't been made public. Within hours, representatives from the Danish Ministry of Defense and the National Archives were on site, joined quickly by observers from American, British, and German embassies who'd been alerted by their respective intelligence services. The decision to open the sealed room took 3 weeks of diplomatic negotiation. The German government argued they had right of access to materials related to their wartime activities. The British and Americans insisted that any agreement from 1946 remained binding until formally dissolved. And the Danish government, caught between respecting sovereignty and satisfying public interest, ultimately decided that 80 years was long enough for secrets to remain buried. On April 3, 2025, cutting torches finally breached the steel door. The smell that emerged was dry paper, old leather, and something chemical that hazmat specialists couldn't immediately identify. When lights were shown into the space beyond, they revealed a room approximately 5 meters square, its walls lined with filing cabinets and wooden crates, all bearing German military markings. And in the center of the room, sitting at a desk as if he'd simply stood up and walked away moments before, was a Wehrmacht uniform on a mannequin, the collar tabs indicating the rank of general lieutenant, and pinned to the uniform's chest was a nameplate, Friedrich Kleist. But Kleist himself wasn't there. What was there, arranged with obvious care, was a complete archive of his activities in Denmark from 1942 to 1945. Thousands of documents, meticulously organized and indexed, orders issued and received, correspondence with Danish officials, intelligence reports, and most significantly, detailed records of a program that appeared nowhere in official German war records or post-war Allied investigations. The program was codenamed Project Bewahrung, Project Preservation, and according to the documents in that sealed room, it represented Friedrich Kleist's personal mission to preserve cultural and historical materials from Denmark that would otherwise be destroyed, seized by the SS, or lost in the chaos of occupation and eventual liberation. The record showed that Kleist had used his authority as occupation commander to secretly protect Danish Jewish families, document resistance activities with an eye toward post-war reconciliation, and, most incredibly, coordinate with Danish museum officials to hide artifacts and artworks that the Reich wanted shipped to Germany. But the documents also revealed something darker. Kleist's preservation efforts weren't entirely altruistic. He'd made a deal. With British intelligence, with Danish resistance leaders, and possibly with elements of the American OSS. In exchange for his cooperation in protecting Danish cultural heritage and passing military intelligence, he would be allowed to disappear after the war. No prosecution, no public acknowledgement of his role. Just safe passage to a location where he could live out his remaining years in obscurity, his wartime service acknowledged only by those few who knew the truth. The sealed room contained proof of that deal in the form of letters signed by British intelligence officers, promising considerations regarding post-war treatment in exchange for Kleist's continued cooperation. And it contained evidence that the deal had been honored. Travel documents showing Kleist had been smuggled back into Denmark in April 1945, hidden by the Petersen family, and eventually provided with false identity papers that allowed him to live openly as a Danish citizen named Frederik Christensen. The investigation team stood in that sealed room, reading documents that challenged everything they thought they knew about Denmark's occupation and liberation. And slowly, inevitably, they began asking questions that authorities on 3 continents had hoped would never be asked. Where was Kleist now? If he'd been given false identity, when had he died? Where was he buried? And most importantly, what other deals had been made in the chaos of 1945? What other war criminals had been allowed to vanish in exchange for cooperation? And how many more sealed rooms might exist, waiting to reveal truths that powerful people had spent 80 years trying to keep buried? The investigation into the sealed room's contents consumed 6 months, with teams of historians, intelligence analysts, and forensic specialists working through thousands of documents that painted a picture far more complex than anyone had anticipated. What emerged was the story of Friedrich Kleist's extraordinary double life, a German general who'd used his authority during occupation to protect thousands while simultaneously preparing his own escape from inevitable judgment. The most significant discovery came in a locked strongbox hidden beneath the room's floorboards. Inside were personal journals spanning from 1942 to 1963, written in Kleist's distinctive handwriting and detailing not just his wartime activities but his entire post-war existence. The first entry, dated April 15, 1945, confirmed what the documents suggested. "I am dead." General Lieutenant Friedrich Kleist died somewhere between Frankfurt and Berlin, his body lost in the chaos of the Reich's collapse. The man writing these words is Frederik Christensen, a Danish farmer who lost his family to German occupation and now lives quietly, trying to forget what he once was. The journals revealed that Kleist had been smuggled back into Denmark by British intelligence operatives in April 1945, hidden by the Petersen family who'd agreed to shelter him in exchange for his earlier protection of their surviving children. The deal had been brokered by resistance leaders who remembered Kleist's refusal to execute hostages after sabotage attacks, his warnings that allowed Jewish families to escape before SS raids, and his deliberate incompetence in pursuing partisan activities that frustrated Berlin but saved Danish lives. But the price of that protection had been steep and explicitly detailed in documents bearing signatures from British MI6, American OSS, and Danish resistance commanders. Kleist was required to provide complete documentation of Project Bewahrung, revealing every artifact he'd hidden, every Danish family he'd protected, and every piece of intelligence he'd passed to the Allies during 3 years of occupation. More significantly, he was required to testify in secret before a joint Allied-Danish commission that would determine whether his actions during occupation constituted crimes or legitimate resistance to SS policies that even Wehrmacht officers found abhorrent. The commission met in Copenhagen over 6 weeks in late 1945, conducting hearings in a sealed military facility where witnesses were brought under armed guard and testimony was recorded but never transcribed for public record. The Commission's report, sealed in 1946 under the classified annexes of the Treaty of Copenhagen, concluded that Kleist had operated in a moral gray zone that defied easy judgment. He'd enforced occupation policies that restricted Danish freedom, collected intelligence that facilitated German military operations, and benefited from a system that exploited Danish resources for the Reich's war effort. But he'd also prevented atrocities, protected civilians, and preserved cultural heritage that would have been destroyed or looted without his intervention. The evidence presented to the Commission was overwhelming in its complexity. Danish Jewish survivors testified that Kleist's warnings had saved entire communities, giving them hours or days to escape before SS raids that he'd been powerless to prevent but could at least delay. Museum directors described how Kleist had helped them hide priceless artifacts that German authorities wanted shipped to Berlin, creating false inventories and bureaucratic tangles that protected Denmark's cultural heritage. And resistance leaders, many of whom had fought against German occupation with weapons and sabotage, admitted that Kleist had been their most valuable source of intelligence about SS operations, Wehrmacht deployments, and Berlin's strategic planning. But there were also damning testimonies. Witnesses described Danish civilians arrested by Kleist's troops for resistance activities, some executed despite his professed opposition to collective punishment. Business owners who'd been forced to cooperate with German economic exploitation under threat of SS intervention. And most troubling, evidence that Kleist had known about and failed to prevent the deportation of Danish Jews to camps, even as he'd helped others escape. The Commission's recommendation, accepted by all parties but kept secret for 80 years, was that Kleist would not be prosecuted but would live in permanent exile under Danish supervision. He would surrender all assets, accept a new identity, and live under surveillance that would ensure he posed no threat and made no attempt to resume his former life or identity. His cooperation would continue, providing testimony and intelligence about other German officers and Nazi officials whenever requested. And his existence would be denied by all governments involved, creating a fiction that Generalleutnant Friedrich Kleist had died in the war's final chaos like so many others. Frederik Christensen, the identity Kleist assumed, lived in Aalborg for 18 years after the war. The journals documented a life of quiet penance, farming the land with the Peterson family, teaching their grandchildren German in secret, and writing detailed accounts of his wartime service that he hoped would one day provide historical context for his actions. The daily entries painted a picture of a man wrestling with guilt, isolation, and the question of whether his deal with the Allies had been morally justified or simply a coward's escape from judgment. June 12, 1947. 2 years since I became Frederick. The Peterson children ask about my accent, why I speak Danish with German pronunciation. I tell them I learned the language late in life. It's not a lie, exactly. Everything I say now is not a lie, exactly. I exist in a space between truth and fiction, neither German nor Danish, neither criminal nor hero. Perhaps that's the punishment I deserve, not death or imprisonment, but this eternal ambiguity. The journals revealed that Kleist had been contacted periodically by intelligence services throughout the 1950s, required to provide information about former colleagues, Nazi networks, and underground movements of former SS officers trying to escape justice. He cooperated fully, his intelligence contributing to the capture of at least 7 war criminals who'd attempted to flee to South America. But each cooperation deepened his isolation, reminding him that he existed only as a tool, valued not for who he was, but for what he knew about others who'd served the Reich. In 1956, Kleist wrote an entry that suggested profound despair. The Americans want names. The British want locations. The Danes want assurance I'll never reveal what deals were made. Everyone wants something except acknowledgement that I'm human, that I made choices in impossible circumstances, that history is more complex than victors and villains. But perhaps I don't deserve that acknowledgement. Perhaps men who wore the Wehrmacht uniform, regardless of what we did while wearing it, deserve only to be forgotten. But the journals also documented moments of connection and redemption. The Peterson children, who'd grown up knowing Frederick as a kindly farm worker who told stories and fixed broken tools, became adults who considered him family. When the youngest daughter married in 1958, Kleist walked her down the aisle in place of the father she'd lost to German reprisals. The wedding photographs, discovered among the sealed room's contents, showed a 71-year-old man in Danish farm clothes, tears streaming down his face, giving away a bride who represented everything his occupation had nearly destroyed. In 1963, at age 76, Kleist died of a heart attack while working in the fields. The Petersons buried him in their family plot under the name Frederick Christensen, a man they'd come to respect for his humility and his refusal to excuse what he'd done in service to a regime he'd come to despise. The funeral was attended by 17 people, all Danish, none of whom knew that the man they were burying had commanded occupation forces 20 years earlier. The pastor's eulogy described Frederick as a man who'd known suffering and chosen kindness, who'd worked the land with the devotion of someone seeking redemption through honest labor. The sealed room beneath the farmhouse had been prepared years before Kleist's death, a project he'd undertaken in 1960 when declining health made him confront his mortality. He'd meticulously organized documents and journals, creating a historical archive that he believed future generations would need to understand the complexities of occupation, collaboration, and resistance. The room's existence had been known only to the eldest Peterson son, who'd helped construct the false wall and who'd taken the secret to his grave in 2003. But the discovery in 2025 revealed something the journals hadn't directly addressed until the final years. Among the documents were intelligence reports that Kleist had compiled but never shared with his Allied handlers. Reports about other German officers who'd made similar deals, who'd been allowed to disappear in exchange for cooperation. Names, locations, the terms of their arrangements, and, most disturbing, evidence of crimes they'd committed before being granted immunity. A network of protected war criminals who'd traded information and influence for anonymity and second chances. The list contained 15 names, each with detailed files documenting wartime service, post-war arrangements, and assumed identities. Some had protected hundreds of civilians during occupation, using their authority to mitigate SS brutality. Others had committed atrocities but possessed intelligence about Nazi gold, hidden weapons, or underground networks that Allied intelligence deemed valuable enough to trade for freedom. The files didn't judge. They simply documented, leaving readers to wrestle with the implications of pragmatism over justice. The Danish government's response to this revelation was immediate and defensive. Officials argued that deals made in 1945's chaos shouldn't be judged by 2025's standards, that the intelligence provided by these protected individuals had been valuable during the Cold War's early years, when understanding Soviet intentions and Nazi underground networks was critical to Western security. They pointed out that most of the 15 had died decades ago, that exposing their identities now served no practical justice purpose, and that dishonoring agreements made in good faith would discourage future cooperation with intelligence services. But Holocaust survivor organizations and historical accountability groups disagreed vehemently, demanding full disclosure of who'd been protected, what crimes they'd committed, and what intelligence had been deemed valuable enough to justify granting them immunity. Public protests erupted outside government buildings in Copenhagen, London, and Washington. Descendants of Danish resistance fighters killed by German occupation forces demanded to know if their killers had been among those protected. And historical commissions in multiple countries launched investigations into intelligence operations from 1945 to 1950, seeking to understand how many deals had been made and whether any of the protected individuals remained alive. The debate consumed international media for months, forcing uncomfortable conversations about moral compromises made in service of security interests. Documents from the sealed room were partially declassified, revealing that at least 15 other German officers, 3 SS members, and 2 Gestapo officials had been given false identities and protection in exchange for cooperation with Allied intelligence. Most had died by 1980, but 3 had lived into the 21st century, dying in obscurity under false names in countries that had no idea of their true identities. 2 had been living in Denmark itself, protected by the same network that had sheltered Kleist, dying as respected citizens whose obituaries praised their contributions to their communities. The exposure of these cases prompted soul-searching in Denmark, Britain, and the United States about the moral compromises made in the name of intelligence gathering and Cold War pragmatism. Parliamentary inquiries were launched. Intelligence services were forced to open archives that had been sealed for decades, and families of war crimes victims demanded answers about why murderers had been allowed to live comfortable lives while their victims were forgotten. But the documents also revealed something that complicated simple condemnation of the deals. Project Bewahrung, Kleist's preservation program, had saved more than cultural artifacts. Working with Danish resistance and sympathetic civilians, he'd documented the fates of 1,247 Danish Jews who'd been deported by the SS, providing detailed records that helped survivors trace family members after the war. He'd hidden architectural plans for historic buildings that German authorities wanted destroyed, preserving Denmark's cultural heritage for post-war restoration. He'd compiled testimony from hundreds of Danish civilians about their experiences under occupation, creating an oral history archive that had been thought lost, but which the sealed room revealed had been preserved all along. And most significantly, he'd maintained a folder marked Zur Anklage for prosecution, containing evidence of SS war crimes that he'd witnessed but been unable to prevent. Testimonies he'd secretly recorded from Danish civilians about atrocities, complete with dates, locations, and names of perpetrators. Several of these accounts corroborated testimonies given at Nuremberg, but which had been questioned due to lack of supporting evidence. Kleist's documents provided that evidence, confirming stories that had been dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda, and leading to renewed interest in prosecuting war criminals who'd escaped justice. Among the most significant discoveries was documentation of the Frøslev concentration camp's operations, where Danish resistance members and civilians had been imprisoned by German authorities. Kleist's intelligence reports detailed conditions, guard identities, and evidence of executions that had been officially denied. This evidence, combined with survivor testimony, had led to post-war prosecutions of camp guards and administrators. But what Kleist's documents revealed was that he'd been feeding this intelligence to the Allies in real time, enabling them to pressure Danish authorities to improve conditions and prevent mass executions that SS officers had proposed. The moral complexity of Kleist's legacy defied easy categorization. He'd served an evil regime, enforced its policies, and benefited from occupation while Danish civilians suffered. He'd arrested resistance members, confiscated property, and participated in systems of exploitation that had enriched Germany at Denmark's expense. But he'd also used his position to mitigate suffering, preserve culture, and document crimes that might otherwise have been forgotten. He'd risked execution by passing intelligence to the Allies, and had ultimately sacrificed his identity, his family, and his future to escape a past he couldn't undo. The question that historians, ethicists, and survivor communities continued to debate was whether Kleist's actions justified the deal that allowed him to escape prosecution. Did the lives he saved outweigh the crimes he enabled? Did intelligence he provided warrant immunity from judgment? And more fundamentally, did the complexities of occupation create moral spaces where traditional categories of guilt and innocence no longer applied? In October 2025, after months of debate and consultation with survivor communities, historical organizations, and ethicists from multiple countries, Danish authorities announced their decision about the sealed room's contents and Kleist's legacy. The documents would be transferred to the National Archives, with most materials made publicly available after appropriate redaction of information that could compromise living individuals or ongoing intelligence operations. A research institute would be established to study the complexities of occupation, collaboration, and resistance, using Kleist's archive as its foundational collection. and a memorial would be installed at the farmhouse site, acknowledging both the suffering of Danish civilians under occupation and the moral complexities faced by individuals who tried to navigate impossible circumstances. But the most controversial decision involved Frederick Christensen's grave. After extensive debate, authorities announced it would be marked with both names, acknowledging that the man buried there was General Lieutenant Friedrich Kleist, who'd become Frederick Christensen, occupation commander who'd become protector, German officer who'd become Danish farmer, war criminal who'd escaped justice and earned redemption. The marker would include text in Danish, German, and English, stating that history's judgment remained incomplete and perhaps always would be, that moral complexity resisted simple categorization, and that understanding the past required acknowledging shades of gray that made us uncomfortable, but which reflected the reality of human choices made under impossible circumstances. The decision sparked protests from those who believed Kleist deserved no recognition, no memorial, no acknowledgement beyond condemnation. Holocaust survivors and their descendants argued that granting any form of honor to a Wehrmacht officer, regardless of later actions, normalized occupation and minimized suffering. But the decision also received support from descendants of Danish Jews and resistance members who'd been saved by Kleist's actions, who argued that denying his complexity served neither history nor justice, that acknowledging his contradictions didn't excuse his crimes but provided necessary context for understanding occupation's moral landscape. Among the most moving responses came from Ruth Abrahamson, a 98-year-old Holocaust survivor whose family had escaped Denmark in 1943 with warning provided by Kleist's intelligence network. "I spent 70 years hating the man who commanded German forces in my country," she said in a recorded interview that was broadcast internationally. "Learning that he was the one who saved my family's lives doesn't erase that hatred. I can't forgive him for wearing the uniform, for serving the Reich, for participating in systems that murdered millions. But I can acknowledge that he made choices within that system that saved lives, including mine. And perhaps that acknowledgement, that recognition that even in darkness some people made choices that created light, is what history requires of us. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but acknowledgement of complexity." The sealed room in the Danish farmhouse had revealed more than documents about one man's wartime service and post-war exile. It had exposed uncomfortable truths about how World War II's moral landscape was more complex than popular narratives acknowledged. That some who wore enemy uniforms had resisted from within. That deals were made that compromised justice in service of pragmatism. That intelligence operations valued information over accountability. And that 80 years later, we still struggled to reconcile the necessity of those compromises with the principles we claimed defined us. Friedrich Kleist had lived two lives separated by geography, identity, and moral reckoning. One as a German general enforcing occupation, making choices that facilitated exploitation while trying to minimize brutality. Another as a Danish farmer living in exile, working land that symbolized everything his uniform had threatened, seeking redemption through labor and documentation. His choice to cooperate with allies rather than face trial was morally questionable but strategically valuable. His documentation of both his crimes and his resistance provided historians with evidence they'd never possessed. And his journals, written in lonely exile over 18 years, offered insights into the psychological cost of moral compromise that academic history rarely captured. In the end, what was in the Danish house shocked experts not because it revealed unknown crimes or dramatic treasures, but because it forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths about how justice, pragmatism, and historical memory intersect in ways that resist simple narratives. The story of General Lieutenant Friedrich Kleist, who became Frederick Christensen and then became a symbol of moral complexity, would be debated by historians for generations. The sealed room where he'd placed his legacy would stand as a reminder that some secrets, when finally revealed, don't provide closure but demand continued questioning of assumptions we'd thought settled 80 years ago. and the grave marked with 2 names would serve as testament to the truth that human beings, even in circumstances that seem to demand absolute judgment, remain complicated, contradictory, and ultimately irreducible to simple categories of good and evil. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.